Arizona Territory, 1879. The air was dry, the sun high, and Zadie Fletcher was out of options. She stood in the dusty doorway of Hanley's trading post, one hand gripping her worn shawl, the other resting protectively on her daughter's shoulder. Her son clutched her skirt, silent, eyes wide. All three bore the look of people who had lost too much too fast. "I can't pay what I owe," Zadie said, voice steady but quiet. "But I have my hands. Can cook, mend, clean. I will work off the debt, fair and honest. Just do not turn us out." Will Hanley, swollen with sweat and smugness, leaned back in his chair behind the counter, chewing a stick of licorice like it was a cigar. "You owe $38.60, Mrs. Fletcher. That's more than workin' off scraps'll cover. I ain't runnin' a charity." "I have nothing else," she said, her chin lifting. "No land, no family. My husband's been dead near 6 months. There's nothing left of the ranch but dust and broken boards." Hanley's eyes shifted toward the children. "Well, you ain't bad on the eyes for a widow. Could work it off upstairs. We always need more girls at the saloon." Zadie's cheeks flushed with shame, but she didn't move. "If it means my children eat, I'll do what I must." Her daughter, Miriam, only 9, turned her face toward her mother's side, not understanding all the words but knowing enough. Her younger brother, Matthew, held tighter to her skirt. Hanley grinned, the kind of grin that made Zadie's stomach twist. "You're offering yourself as collateral, then?" The door creaked open behind them. Boots stepped slow, measured. Dust swirled around tall boots and a long, dark duster. Zadie turned, eyes narrowing against the sun. A stranger stood in the doorway, dust-covered hat, face shadowed beneath the brim. He looked like he had ridden straight out of the desert, and maybe he had. His voice was low and even. "She said she owes $38.60? Hanley blinked. "Yeah." The stranger stepped forward, pulling a leather pouch from his saddlebag. Jingled. He dropped it on the counter. "That should cover it." Hanley opened the pouch. His jaw dropped as he counted the coins. "This is over $50. "Keep the change," the man said. He turned toward Zadie. "You and your children, you are free of debt." Zadie stared at him. "Why would you do that?" The man looked at her, really looked, and something in his eyes, not pity but understanding, made her pulse pause. "Because you should not have to pay with yourself," he said. She blinked, throat tight. "I do not even know your name." "Xalen Lorne," he said. "And I am no savior, Mrs. Fletcher. Just someone passing through." She swallowed hard. Zadie Fletcher. These are my children, Miriam and Matthew." He gave a short nod, his gaze flicking to the children. "You got somewhere to go?" She shook her head. "Ranch is gone. We were living in a half-burned barn until 2 nights ago. Then the roof caved in." Xalen glanced back toward the door where his horse stood tied. "Then you were coming with me." Zadie tensed. "Why would I? I have a cabin. North of here, up past the Salt River. It is quiet. Safe. You and the children can stay there until you figure out your next step." She stared at him, heart pounding. "You do not know me." "I just paid off your debt," he said simply. "I know enough." Zadie looked down at Miriam and Matthew. Their faces were drawn, tired, hungry. She looked back up at the man. "All right," she said, "but only until I can stand on my own." The ride north took 2 days. Xalen led slow, stopping for the children, never pushing too hard. He barely spoke, but when he did, his voice was calm, steady. He set out food without fuss, kept the fire going, rode with a quiet watchfulness that made Zadie feel safer than she had in months. By the time they reached the cabin, a sturdy wooden place tucked beneath cottonwoods near a creek, Miriam was asleep in Zadie's lap and Matthew's head rested on her shoulder. Xalen dismounted first, then helped her down. He lifted the children gently, carrying them inside without waking them. The cabin smelled of cedar and old leather. It had 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, wooden shelves lined with dry goods and tools. There was no clutter, no softness. Just what was needed. "I will sleep in the barn," Xalen said, setting Matthew in a cot. "You take the bed. The girl can sleep beside you." Zadie looked at him. "You really mean to let us stay here?" He nodded once. "You are not a burden." She watched him go, the door clicking shut behind him. The days that followed were quiet but full. Zadie washed clothes in the creek, cooked meals from the supplies he had, and mended the children's worn clothes. Xalen chopped wood, made repairs, hunted. He never asked anything of her. But every evening, after the children fell asleep, he would sit outside beneath the stars and she would join him. Sometimes they talked. Other times, they just sat in silence, side by side, watching the fire burn low. One night, as crickets sang and the creek murmured nearby, she asked, "Why are you alone out here?" He was quiet for a moment. Saw too much, wanted less. She looked at him. "You fought in the war?" He nodded. "My husband did too," she said. "Came home with a piece of him missing. Not something you could see. He drank it away. Then the fever came." Xalen's gaze found hers. "I am sorry. I am tired of being sorry," she whispered. "I just want to feel safe again." He did not speak, but he reached over and gently took her hand. And for the first time in months, she exhaled without fear. Spring softened the edges of the land. Flowers bloomed along the creek. The children began to laugh again. Zadie caught herself watching Xalen when he worked. The way his hands moved, steady and sure. The way he crouched to speak to Matthew, always at the child's eye level. The way Miriam started leaving her drawings on the porch, knowing he would see them. One afternoon, while she scrubbed linens, Xalen came up behind her, holding a carved wooden figure. It was a horse, small and smooth, with careful detail. "For Matthew," he said. She took it from him, her hands brushing his. "You made this?" He nodded. Zadie looked up at him, heart beating faster. "You are not just passing through, are you?" He held her gaze. "Not anymore." And when he kissed her, it was slow and sure, like he had been waiting for her to be ready. She kissed him back, grasping his shirt, feeling the steady thrum of life returning to her chest. She had offered herself as collateral, but this quiet, steady man had bought her heart instead. The sound of Miriam's laughter drifted through the cottonwoods, clear and light as she ran barefoot along the creek's edge, her hem gathered in one hand. Matthew crouched in the shallows, stacking smooth stones into a wobbling tower, his face streaked with river mud. Zadie stirred the pot above the hearth, the scent of rabbit stew rising into the cabin's warm air. Her sleeves were rolled, hair braided tight against the breeze that snuck under the eaves. She was thinner than she had been when they arrived, but there was color in her cheeks now, and her hands didn't tremble when she held a spoon. Outside, Xalen split fence rails. The sound of the axe rang sharp and steady, each swing measured. He'd stripped down to his undershirt, sweat darkening the linen as he worked with quiet focus. It hadn't taken long to see he was the kind of man who did things right the first time, not for show, but because he couldn't stomach doing them halfway. Zadie stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. "I think you've rebuilt that fence twice over already," she said, shading her eyes. He didn't pause. "The elk keep testing it. If I'm going to keep the garden safe, it needs to hold." "There's no garden yet." "There will be," he said. "You've already cleared the ground behind the shed." She leaned against the porch rail, the wood warm beneath her palms. "You've been watching me. I notice things," he said, planting the axe in the stump. She crossed the yard, stopping a few feet from him. "You never asked what I want to do with this place. I figured you'd tell me when you knew." Zadie looked past him toward the hills that rolled pale gold against the sky. "I used to think I'd leave Arizona behind. Go back east, maybe? Somewhere with trees that don't tear the sky open come August. But," she met his gaze, "but I've never known another place that forced me to grow roots just to survive." He nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "You're not just surviving anymore." "No," she said softly. "I'm not." They stood in silence a moment, the wind rustling the cottonwoods. Then she said, "Do you mind if I ask where you're from?" "New Mexico," he said, "north of Socorro. My father was a freighter, hauled ore. My mother kept goats and read me the Book of Psalms in Spanish." Zadie tilted her head. You don't sound like you were raised in a church house. I wasn't, he said. But she believed in quiet truths. I remember her voice more than the words. She stepped closer. You ever think of going back? He looked down, then away. They died when I was 16. Fever swept through the camp. I buried them both. Her hand reached for his, reflexive. I'm sorry. I'm not, he said, then added, not anymore. They had peace. I didn't. Took me a long time to stop looking for something to fight. Zadie's hand stayed in his. And now? He looked at her and something softened behind his eyes. Now I fix fences. And carve wooden horses. She smiled. You're good with your hands. His voice dropped slightly. So are you. Neither of them moved, but the air changed. The kind of quiet that wasn't empty but full of everything unsaid. Then Miriam's voice rang out from the creek. Mama. Matthew fell in. Zadie turned sharply, already running. I'm coming. By the time she reached them, Matthew was standing soaked to the waist, teeth chattering, but grinning. Zadie knelt, pulling off her apron to dry his arms. You're a little fish now, she said, gently toweling his head. You scared me. I slipped, he said, still giggling. But I saved the tower. Xalen was already beside them, holding out a dry shirt from the cabin. Zadie helped Matthew out of his wet one, noting how easily Xalen crouched beside them. Never rushed, never impatient. That night, after the children were asleep, Zadie sat on the porch steps, her hands folded in her lap. The stars were bright above, sharp-edged and clear. Xalen joined her without a word, easing down beside her. I want to stay, she said quietly. He turned his head. I want to build something here, she continued. Not just for the children. For me. For us. He didn't answer right away. Then, slowly, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He handed it to her. She opened it. Inside was a drawing, rough but careful, of the cabin, with a garden behind it, a line of chickens, and 3 small figures standing out front. One taller beside her. Zadie looked up, her throat tight. You already saw it, she whispered. He nodded. You made it possible. She leaned into him then, her head against his shoulder. His arm came around her, solid and warm. There was no need to speak. Everything that mattered was already understood. The days lengthened into early summer, the light lingering in gold bands across the porch floorboards by evening. Zadie had started rising before the sun, kneading dough by lantern glow, the flour sack tied shut with a twine knot she'd learned from Xalen. The cabin no longer felt borrowed. It felt lived, and there were faint scuffs beneath Miriam's chair, a line of Matthew's handprints on the edge of the table, and a patched curtain she'd sewn from the remnants of her old Sunday dress. That morning, Xalen returned from the high ridge with a woven satchel slung across his back. Zadie met him outside the barn, where she'd been gathering the last of the feed into a wooden pail. Found something, she asked. He slid the satchel off and opened it wide. Inside were green stalks and purple-tipped blooms. Yerba buena, he said, and wild onions. The rains left enough along the north slope. Zadie reached in, lifting one of the herbs to her nose. I haven't smelled this since I was a girl, she murmured. Mama used to steep it when we had coughs. He nodded. Figured it might help come fall. She looked up at him, the light catching in the curve of his jaw. You think that far ahead? I used to think only one day at a time, he said. Now I think in seasons. Zadie touched the corner of the satchel. I'd like to learn what grows where. I was never good at that. I'll take you next time, he said. She smiled, and the wind lifted her braids slightly as they walked toward the porch. Later, while the children napped in the shade of the cottonwoods, Zadie sat cross-legged on a wool blanket near the creek. Xalen crouched beside her, spreading the plants into separate piles. He moved with quiet intent, placing the roots and leaves in rows. His fingers were stained with soil, and he worked without hesitation, like the land had taught him, in silence. Zadie watched him. You ever think about what home means now? He didn't look up. It used to be a place. Now it's a person. She felt the words settle into her chest like warm stones. That night, after the fire had burned down and the children were tucked beneath their quilts, Zadie lingered at the door, watching moths drift toward the lantern's glow. Xalen was brushing down the horse in the barn. She crossed the yard barefoot, the earth still warm from the day's sun. He looked up as she stepped inside. Couldn't sleep? She reached for the brush in his hand and took over, her strokes slow and even. I kept thinking about what you said, she said. About home. His voice was low. I meant it. I know, she said. And I don't want to wait for another season to pass before I say what's on my heart. He stood still, the brush resting against the horse's flank. I choose this, she said. Not because I need to, but because I want to. I want to wake beside you. I want to plant that garden. I want to grow old under this roof. He reached out, brushing a piece of hay from her sleeve. You've never asked me to stay. You never gave me reason to doubt you would, she said. His hand cupped the side of her face, rough thumb brushing lightly along her cheekbone. Then let's build this life. Not in pieces. All of it. She leaned into his touch, eyes closing. All of it. They stood that way a long while, the horse shifting quietly beside them, the scent of hay and warm earth around them. And when they stepped out beneath the stars, her fingers found his without searching. Behind them, the lantern still glowed in the window, soft, steady, and home. Xalen stood at the edge of the newly turned soil behind the cabin, his shovel sunk deep into the earth. The plot stretched in a neat rectangle bordered by stones Miriam and Matthew had collected from the creek bed. Zadie knelt nearby, smoothing rows with the side of her hand, her wrists smudged with dirt. The sun hadn't yet climbed above the ridge, but the morning air was already warming, full of insects humming and the faint rustle of quail in the brush. I saved the last row for you, she said, glancing up. He stepped beside her, wiping his palms on his trousers. What are we planting? Beans, she said. They climb if you give them something to hold on to. He knelt and took the seeds from her palm, pressing them into the soil one by one. Seems they know how to survive. They do more than survive, she said. They fix the soil while they grow. Make it better for whatever comes next. He looked at her and she didn't need to say more. Inside the cabin, Matthew's voice rose in muffled complaint. Too early, too cold, too something, and Zadie stood, brushing off her skirt. I'll get them up, she said. You finish here. She left the door open behind her. Xalen stayed kneeling, one hand resting in the dark earth. He finished planting the row, then stood slowly, feeling the stretch in his back and the pull of the scar along his ribs, one of the older ones, a blade from a border skirmish 4 years before. He pressed his palm against it, then looked up as the door banged gently in the breeze. Later that afternoon, Zadie sat cross-legged beneath the mesquite tree, a wide tin basin between her knees. She snapped dry corn husks into a pile beside her, sorting kernels for the next meal. Xalen sat nearby on a stump, working the edge of a leather strap with a carving blade, his elbows resting on his thighs. Your scar, she said, not looking up. I saw it last week, when you lifted the hay bale. He didn't answer at first, only continued working the leather until the strip split clean. How bad was it, she asked. Deep enough to remind me, he said. Not deep enough to finish me. She set the husks aside. You never speak of what happened before. Before Hanley's post. Before us. I don't carry it unless I have to, he said. But I'll tell you if you want to know. I'd like to, she said. Not because I need every piece of your past. Just because I want to understand the man I'm building a life with. He set the blade down and leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees. I rode with a freight outfit through Sonora, he said. We hauled goods between mining camps, sometimes through places that weren't marked on any map. I saw men cut down for a sack of flour. I left after a boy not much older than Matthew was shot for refusing to give up his boots. Zadie's hands stilled. I tried to stop it, he said. I failed. She reached across the space between them, her fingers curling around his wrist. You didn't fail here, she said. You gave us more than shelter. You gave us a second beginning. He turned his hand beneath hers, palm up, and let her hold it. That evening, after the children were asleep and the scent of simmered cornmeal lingered in the air, Xalen brought out a small, oil-wrapped parcel. He set it on the table, brushing the crumbs from its edge before unwrapping it. Inside was a length of soft leather, dyed a rich brown, shaped into a pair of children's moccasins. "They'll outgrow them by autumn," he said. "But maybe Matthew can wear them now." Zadie lifted one gently. "You made these for him?" "I've had the pattern since before I met you," he said. "Never had reason to use it until now." She looked at him, something behind her eyes tightening and softening all at once. "When we first came here, I kept thinking I was just borrowing time," she said. "That we'd leave before we could belong." "You belong," he said simply. She stepped around the table, the moccasin still in her hand, and stood before him. "I want to marry you," she said. "No courthouse papers, just our word and what we've built." He rose slowly, his hands coming to rest on her waist. "I don't need a preacher to know you're mine," he said. "But I'll stand beside you in front of one if it brings you peace." She shook her head. "This is peace." They stood in the center of the room, the fire low behind them, the wind threading through the open window. And when she leaned into him, he gathered her close, not as a woman he'd rescued, but as the one he had chosen to walk beside, one day into the next. The preacher arrived on horseback 2 days after the letter had been sent from the trading post. His name was Reverend Tully, a wiry man with a sun-darkened neck and a voice like worn flannel. He tied his gelding to the cottonwood and shook Xalen's hand with a short nod. "Your letter said plain," the preacher said. "Simple vows, no crowd, no fuss. I can do that." Zadie stood on the porch, Miriam beside her, both dressed in clean calico. Matthew leaned against the doorframe, his face scrubbed, hair combed down flat. The breeze pulled at the edge of the curtain behind him. They gathered in the yard, the sun high and sharp, casting long shadows under the trees. There was no music, no witness but the land itself. Still, the moment held. Reverend Tully opened a thin, leather-bound book and cleared his throat. "The Lord joins where the heart has already chosen." Zadie reached for Xalen's hand. She didn't tremble. Her voice was steady. "I give you my days and I ask for yours. Not to be carried, but to walk together." Xalen's grip was warm and firm. "You are the peace I never hoped to find. I will stand beside you as long as the earth gives us time." The preacher closed the book. "That's enough of words. You've made your promises. That's binding enough." Miriam handed Zadie a ring carved from bone and sanded smooth on the inside, the one Xalen had made by lantern light the week before. Zadie slipped it onto his finger, and he kissed hers in return. They didn't cheer. They didn't shout. But something in the stillness hollowed out and filled again like water finding its level. That night, after the children slept in the loft and the fire burned low, Zadie sat at the edge of their bed, brushing the last of the dust from her braid. "I was thinking," she said, "we could add a lean-to off the back. Just a small one. Miriam's getting taller. She'll want her own space soon." Xalen set aside the ledger he'd begun keeping of supplies and planting dates. "We can start it before the rains come," he said. "I'll need to trade for more nails." She turned toward him. "You've been keeping track of things. We'll need to plan for winter," he said. "If we want chickens come spring, we'll need a coop before the ground hardens." Zadie drew her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. "I want to teach them to read. Properly. Not just letters. Stories. My mama had a reader once. I could write to my cousin in Kansas, see if they've got one to spare." Xalen nodded. "I can whittle them slates. With chalk, they won't waste paper." They sat in the quiet for a while, the ticking of the fire the only sound. Then Zadie said, "Do you ever wonder what your mother would have thought of all this?" He looked toward the rafters, then back at her. "She would have liked you." Zadie smiled, eyes warm. "And your father?" "He'd have asked if you could shoot. And then he'd have asked if you had sense enough to leave a place better than you found it." "I think we've done that," she said. "I know we have." She leaned back against the pillow, and he followed, the quilt pulled up to their waists. Her fingers traced the curve of his palm, the ridges worn by work. "Do you think it'll last?" she asked quietly. Xalen turned toward her, his voice low. "We've built it with our hands. That kind of thing doesn't fall easy." She nodded, and for the first time in years, she let herself believe in permanence. By late summer, the garden had taken root. Beans climbed the handmade poles, squash vines crept over the soil, and corn stalks whispered in the wind. The children ran barefoot through the rows, their laughter rising with the heat. Xalen built the lean-to with timber he split himself, and Zadie whitewashed the new wall with lime from a neighboring ranch. The roof held firm against the first hard rain. Reverend Tully passed through again come September and brought a box of books from a church in Prescott. Zadie cried when she opened it. Matthew traced the letters with his finger, and Miriam read aloud until her voice cracked. In the evenings, they sat beneath the stars, not always speaking, but always near. Sometimes Xalen would hum a tune she didn't recognize, and Zadie would lean into him, her head against his shoulder, letting the sound settle deep. They never needed more than what they had. One night, as the last chill of autumn crept in, Zadie stood at the edge of the porch, watching the wind move through the tall grass beyond the fence. Xalen came up behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist. She tilted her head back. "The land's quieting down. It's ready to rest," he said. "So am I," she whispered. He kissed her temple. "Then we'll rest. And come spring, we'll begin again." And they did. Every morning, every season, together, no longer drifting, no longer surviving. Just living, rooted in a place made new by love and kept by the quiet strength of two hands held fast.